Thanks for joining us. Obviously, Dr. Harvey just back from the hustings on the ward, Mr. Ward. Ironically, I've only put those two together for the first time. And you, Dr. Forkin, probably someone who does eat with a fork and spoon. I know I certainly do. Those are probably the worst start-off jokes I've ever heard. We've got a couple of issues we want to talk through.
I'm not a doctor, by the way.
No, you don't have to be a doctor to have a fork and spoon, do you? Who needs a doctor? But our first issue that I want us to talk through tonight is this really interesting one that's come up here. And as you can see, the appeals court rules that the White House overstepped the First Amendment on social media. So a Fifth Circuit panel partly upheld restrictions on the Biden administration's communications with online platforms about their content. Well, that's already interfering, whichever way you look at it. A three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit narrowed a lower court's restriction on the federal government's contact with social media companies, but they still apply to the White House. So a federal appeals court ruled on Friday that the Biden administration most likely overstepped the First Amendment, if that's not a huge thing, by urging the major social media platforms to remove misleading or false content about the COVID-19 pandemic, partly upholding a lower court's preliminary injunction in what's seen as a victory for conservatives. Steve, over to you. How are you reading this?
Well, first of all, just to put it in the perspective, I've got the actual court document in front of me. So this is the state of Missouri and the state of Louisiana, Aaron Kheriaty, Martin Kulldorff, Jim Hoff, Jay Bhattacharya, and Jill Hines. Now, Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya are two extremely highly credentialed medical professionals that were basically censored. They had their Twitter accounts frozen. They had their Twitter accounts censored during the COVID pandemic. These are people who were the early signatures on the Great Barrington Declaration. And these were, if you wound the clock back to prior to COVID, these were like world-renowned experts in their medical field. And they disagreed with the government perspective or the government rulings, the government narrative. And, it's not about misinformation. As an example, they dared to say that natural immunity is a thing, which is ridiculous when you think about it. I mean, basic scientific things that we've known for hundreds of years, if not longer, that they dared state on social media platforms, and they were censored for that. And
so, Harvey, just while Steve's talking about that, the natural immunity thing, cast your mind back to when the COVID stuff started coming out, and then first couple of months, first 3 months, first 6 months, you live by the scalpel, die by the scalpel in your profession. Was there much talk about natural immunity in the profession as a surgeon?
Well, there was. The surgeons basically didn't have too much say in it. It was mostly physicians and infectious diseases experts.
Sure.
But this is their life. What they do is that they recognize that humans are exposed to pathogens. They have an inbuilt immune system which recognizes them as foreign. They mount an immune response given a reasonable amount of lag time after exposure and incubation to that particular pathogen. And the Ig or immunoglobulin levels rise, and that gives an indication that the person is beginning to mount an immune response to the pathogen. And the long tail and persistence of antibodies suggests how successful the human host is in being able to deal with and manage not only the existing infection, but future exposures to it. So that's immunology in a nutshell. And it was very clear at the time that people who would get infected with COVID or indeed any virus would mount an immune response. And if the immune response wasn't sufficient enough or they were too tardy to do it, they would end up succumbing to the infection and dying, as many elderly, immune compromised and sick people whose immune systems were damaged with diabetes or other types of autoimmune conditions, or who were very ill or old and unable to mount a response. However, in young people, the disease, like most other diseases, was a mild flu, and there would be quite a vigorous response with antibody production, and therefore we were presented with statistics that showed that, in fact, in people who were young, this was nothing more than a flu. Of course, some people may die because of it, but it's a vast minority. And we knew that right from the very beginning. So the question then came up that if you immunize people against it, which is to immunize folk against a pathogen that could kill them, one has to balance whether or not the process of immunization, development of the immunization was safe and well tested in the first place. And then secondly, should it be given to vulnerable people, or must it be given to everybody? Well, there's tremendous advantage to insist it gets given to everybody, because the government can then mandate people get it, and the company that makes it will make a humonous profit,
vast sums of money.
Yeah,
I mean,
Pfizer, Moderna, and so on. So AstraZeneca, to their credit, started the immunization in England, and the woman was knighted for it, or became a dame of the empire, and she developed it. But AstraZeneca fast fell out of favor in favor of the other very big tech companies who were warp speed and fast tracked into producing a vaccine that could be rolled out at the behest of the WHO, and therefore force governments around the world to inoculate their entire population with massive profits. Did it protect them? Perhaps.
But there's obviously a lot of conjecture and debate about the branded words, safe and effective, and there's a lot of doubt around that. Steve, what was your coming back to the article itself? If we look back here and look at the political narratives now starting to come under challenge, and particularly the interference from a biblical Christian perspective, how should we be thinking about this?
Well, I think, first of all, the big question here is, science is not a settled issue. Science is something that is continually changing, and science is something that requires robust debate. And what happened here during this period was that debate was basically stifled in favor of a particular government narrative. So it wasn't really, it was a political narrative rather than a scientific narrative. And the issue of this law is that, of course, the Americans, unlike many other countries, in particular here in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights, so we're not protected against government tyranny as such, whereas Americans are actually protected by their constitution. That doesn't mean that politicians won't do things that are unconstitutional. And in this sense, the Biden administration was caught red-handed, because all throughout the COVID period, they were literally giving orders directly from the White House and from several government institutions, bureaucratic institutions, giving orders to Facebook, Twitter, all the major social media platforms to directly censor people who were saying things that didn't accord with the government narrative. And we're not talking about disinformation and misinformation. These are red herrings. We're talking about censoring people who, prior to COVID, would have been the top experts in the world. But it just so happened that these top experts didn't agree with the stated government narrative. And so the government, rather than saying, let's have a proper debate, let's have a proper, let's hear all the different voices, particularly when they're coming from well-credentialed experts. We're talking about the top experts from Stanford and Harvard University here. These people were just simply censored, and it was entirely unconstitutional.
Well, it's quite remarkable that it gets like that. So, Harvey, in your field, and this happens to be very on point with someone in the medical field, how well regarded is the ability to have debate, to have dispute over empirical facts?
There are a few things at play here, of course.
Sure.
One of them is if you create an emergency, then the government has an elected mandate to try to protect its citizens to the best of its ability.
Yep.
So it has to defer to experts in the field and then make pronouncements based on the public health order. And as you will recently have heard with the governor of New Mexico, every single moral issue or every single governmental issue can be turned into a public health order, whether it be gun control, whether it be dogs on the sidewalk, whether it be traffic lights, whether it be speed cameras, and so on. All of them can finally be whittled down to some element of public health order or public safety, which gives the lawmakers a blanket right to invoke laws in the name of public safety. Now, how well are they informed? Well, they will need to be informed from their selected individuals, and they will go to the institutes which appear to have authority. They will go to the Center for Diseases Control. They would go to the FEMA. They will go to experts who advise the Center for Disease Control. However, the essence of research is to go back in and see whether or not the narrative you've come up with is in fact robust and requires continuous audit and testing. Mm-hmm. And that's true science, where you'll find out that what was pronounced to do this day is now, with new information, found to be useless or in fact harmful, and one must change the narrative. The problem politically with changing narratives, if it's perceived as flip-flopping, and as a result, the population, in order to try to shore up confidence in the talking heads on media and those who represent political power, the narrative has to be well sold. And as Joseph Goebbels in the Nazi Party says, that you've got to catch the people's attention and hold it. And the more you speak a particular narrative, the more likely the majority of people are going to adopt it, because like it or not, they're programmed to accept that somebody speaking on behalf of the government is likely to be true, honest, trustworthy, and right. And here is the difficulty, because there are other voices which may challenge the narrative that comes out, and the government does not want to look flaky, so it will need to select a path and stay on it, no matter how illogical, irrational, or proven incorrect it is, because the political fallout and damage that will result from the uncertainty in the public will make them lose confidence in the authority of government, and that terrifies any dictator. It shouldn't terrify democracy, but it terrifies totalitarian rulers.
And so what's the biblical response here, gents? Just quickly on this one before we move on to the next.
Truth. Truth is the issue. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is good. Think on these things. That is the command of Paul to the Philippians. And Jesus said, all those who are on the side of truth love me. So in the end, it's going to be what is true is defendable, even if the narrative that you kept and tried to defend is proven to be false. It takes the biblical response is, well, then change your narrative. We're sorry. We made a mistake, and we're going to try and fix it. But that would require humility in short supply in government, sadly.
Steve?
Well, I think that the one of the fundamental problems that we have with government is this idea that they have a monopoly on coercion, in that they see themselves as an organization that has a monopoly to tell people what they can and can't do. And traditionally, if you look at the history of the development of the modern state in that sense, people have come up with things such as bills of rights, constitutions. Mostly they are there because people realize that governments at times do bad things and they need to be protected from them. But if from a biblical perspective, I think the real problem arises is that the government views itself as the one that is the objective standard of what is right and wrong, whereas the Bible says no such thing is possible. The only one who has the objective standard to say this is right, this is wrong, is God. The Bible recognizes authority. We see it starting from the authority that starts within a family. The role of a man in the family, the role of a woman in the family, the role of children, and various other leadership notions. But never does the Bible give any objective, in a sense of all-encompassing authority to anybody. The only one who has that is God. In other words, there's always limiting factors. And I think what happens here is the government has seen itself as a self-limiting organization. In other words, it has a monopoly on what is right and what is wrong. And because, of course, we live at a time where truth is very relative, it's something that we see as whatever true is today could be not true tomorrow, because it's just however the culture sees it as true, what we feel to be true, which could be different from you to me to every other person, which is generally how people regard truth. It's like a taste kind of thing. Whereas obviously the Bible defines what is true. I mean, Jesus says, I am the truth. And of course, when humans stop submitting themselves to the absolute authority of the Bible, then they have no yardstick to go by. And of course, generally, I think history is a good place to look, to learn for lessons. The ever-growing power of the state always leads to something essentially bad. And history has demonstrated that over and over and over again.
Well, speaking of which, we're parachuting from, first of all, that first article that we looked at there about government overreach. And now we're looking at, still on the same theme, though, of that particular period of history and the particular vaccines. It's now that there's a Danish peer-reviewed study proves that mRNA vaccines kill more lives than they save. Therefore, it's neither safe nor effective. And this article here on the Brownstone Institute says, have people been given the wrong vaccine? Randomized controlled trials show all-cause mortality reduction from the COVID adenovirus vector vaccines. And Harvey, I'll get you to chip in very briefly about those later on if we need to, but not from mRNA vaccines. That is the verdict from a new Danish study by Dr. Christine Ben and colleagues. Have people been given vaccines that don't work, the Pfizer, Moderna ones, instead of vaccines that do work, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson? Let's put that study to the test, I guess. So the question here, Harvey, over to you when it comes to looking at this particular study. Did you get a chance to read that whole article and the study? What's your take on the variance from those different...
Yeah, unfortunately not, and it's not because I didn't try, because I came home late. However, I do know something about the study and the investigations. I personally had the AstraZeneca shot.
And you're still standing. Look at you.
Well, the AstraZeneca shot worked, and it produced antibody responses. The concern I have is that efficacy of vaccines could be measured like the efficacy in many of the other vaccines, like rubella, varicella, that we give routinely to children and to adults. And we measure whether or not the vaccines are effective by checking to see whether antibody levels are firstly made and then levels are sustained in the serum of the inoculant. So the individual that gets it, we check for rubella for every pregnant woman, and we have a look at the vaccine, at least the antibody levels. If the antibody levels are below 5, we say there's not enough for them to protect the person against rubella. They've got to watch them really carefully. If they get rubella or get infected, they do not have sufficiently robust antibody productions, and they may need some sort of external antibodies, or they might have to be, if they're not pregnant, re-inoculated. Well, why don't we do that with COVID? Given the fact that this is the standard way we measure immunity for viral vaccines. If you ask for COVID antibodies, the laboratory will ask, why are you asking? The obvious reason is to know whether or not the vaccine that has been administered to your patient has in fact produced an antibody response which will protect them against COVID. After all, why are we giving the vaccination? And if the antibody levels are undetectable 2 months or 5 months or 3 months afterwards, you will need boosters. Well, hey, what do we see? We're using booster after booster, and some people are getting their 4th and 5th boosters. Well, obviously, the desired effect of the vaccine has not managed to sustain protection against getting infected by the virus. So can you honestly say that it works? And the proof of the pudding is in this kind of study. Unfortunately, the mRNA vaccines, which codify the abnormal protein that the virus will give you, and make the body's own cells produce large numbers of copies of this antigen, so that your immune system will look at it and produce antibodies. So that's how it works. You generate your own spike protein, and your immune system now has got to recognize it as such and produce antibodies, which it doesn't do very well. However, the mRNA vaccine itself has got side effects. The spike protein that it produces is part of the pathological part of the virus that can hurt and harm. And this is what this peer-reviewed study actually shows.
So I think that, for those of us like me who are not obviously, I'm not a biologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not anything when it comes to the medical profession. So, but the thing that I read the article, I didn't read the study. I wouldn't know how to read a medical study. But the thing that comes out very clearly in this article, and I've seen this now this is not the only study that has demonstrated this, is the one issue that we must look at, and that no one is really at a large scale failing to. Everybody's failing at it. We're not doing it. Is we must look at what's called all-cause mortality. Because the issue here is that the vaccine may save you from COVID and kill you by something else. And so if you only look at COVID, of course, you think, well, the vaccine did really well. And lo and behold, if you compare a cohort of people who are vaccinated against a cohort of people who were not, who received the placebo as such, which is how all traditional medical trials are normally done. We have this thing what the medical professional world would call the gold standard of trialing, which you must do a placebo-controlled group. And in this case here, what's demonstrated in this study is that the all-cause mortality is either the same in both groups or is actually slightly higher amongst the vaccinated group. In other words, demonstrating very clearly that even if the vaccine at some brief period stopped people from dying from COVID, the overall number of people who are vaccinated, more people die in that group than in the unvaccinated group. So it's increasing the number of deaths. So it's not safe, it's not effective, and it's utterly disastrous. And of course,
and I guess that's important because, Steve, it's not you saying that as a non-professional, it's you repeating or citing these studies, peer-reviewed studies that have actually said that. It's not hard for us as intelligent adults to go, that's right, I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist, but these journal articles are, and it's proven that in the last few years, this roundabout that the world went on, because of the political responses to the virus, irrespective of where it came from, but the man-made solutions and the draconian measures that the free world was put under added enormous stress because of some kind of political, seemingly shadowboxing. So the question to wrap up on tonight with this, so maybe Harvey, if you kick off, or maybe we just discuss it briefly. Well, just the biblical response. Are you and your finger again, Steve?
I think it's really important to point out the irony of these two articles here, and that is Martin Kulldorff is one of the people who peer-reviewed this study, by the way. The Brownstone Institute is the one who put the article out, but it's actually peer-reviewed by Martin Kulldorff, who happens to be one of the defendants in the court case that we mentioned earlier on. And he was, right from the word go, very, very suspicious of the narrative that was being portrayed to the public during COVID. And here, lo and behold, the evidence is in favor of what he said all along. And this is one of the people who was censored by, in the name of science, he was censored by the Biden administration. So, they claim it's misinformation, but of course that's absolutely wrong.
Well, it's far from misinformation. So then I really need to
essential life-saving information.
It is. And I guess on that point then, what is a biblical Christian response? Now that these dynamics of the real story are becoming public and getting validated through scientific journals, what are Christians to do with that? What did Christians in the church do previously that perhaps they shouldn't be doing in the future? Maybe just a quick statement each before we wrap up.
Well, my first point of call would be look at the sixth commandment, and maybe just for a bit of context around that, look at the Westminster Confession of Faith. We haven't got time to pull that up because it gives you a detailed look into it. But look, the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder. The Bible takes the sanctity of human life is something that the Bible takes very, very seriously. And no human, whether in government, whether on the pretense of possibly saving somebody else's life, has the right to take or to endanger your life, even if he thinks it might save somebody else. They just do not have that kind of
right. There's a cornucopia of the commandments that have been broken, not surprisingly, because sinful people are going to sin. That's what they do. But the cause and effect of this is clearly governments and lawmakers, whether intentionally or not, some yes, some no, they clearly lied. Clearly people died and were killed as a result of this. And at the same time, they stole, I would think, public money to pay for the people that were creating the things that were killing the people that they were lying about. It's a very nasty, vicious circle. And that's a very heavy-handed way of looking at it. But sinners have got to sin. That's what they do. Harvey, the final statement to wrap us up for tonight. Biblically speaking, Christologically speaking, church speaking, what's a good response to this article and the first one?
Once again, we've got to hold truth. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. All those who love truth love me.
Yeah.
And we've got an obligation to pursue the truth no matter where it leads, and step down from our positions of power and arrogance and be prepared to submit to truth, because truth is actually in a person. And by doing so, and by being honest and repentant, if we have made other people's lives a misery by enacting things that are not true, then we will be following Jesus' pattern of apologizing, repenting, reparation, and that would be loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. So the scientific profession must submit itself to truth. It must be ruthless about submitting itself to truth. It must not bear false witness, and it must recognize that God is no respecter of persons, and every single person is important, and that includes the individuals who are being ground under by ideological bias. So that would be the biblical response. If it's true, then you are more likely to be following Jesus. And if you'll pursue truth till its end, you will arrive at a person, and that's Jesus, our Savior.
That's great. Hey, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Harvey, for joining us on the program this evening. And we look forward to getting people's comments, to liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel as well.